realise there were crochet squares all over the room, and not that they weren't, that the crochet squares weren't floating towards our blanket operation front. So people have been doing squares to be, to be included in the blanket, just so that they can pass them along in a kind of way to me, rather than me go to all the tables and scoop up stuff on the street. Sorry, I thought you knew it was a thing.
I had no idea what's going on. Okay, everybody, want to take your seats? We've made it. We're at the last session of the day. Well done, everyone. I've just been given some sort of weird coded message. If you've been making squares, can you please make sure they get down to that part of the room to be added to the big square? I think that's something for the hookers in the room. So we've got a couple of papers, and then we're into a bit of frivolity before we can all go downstairs where the bar will be open. So yes, our last session, a couple of papers, we'll do the Dumpty Dum sing-along, and then there's a little award ceremony at the end, and we'll also let you know how many years of listening are in the room. We can't all be that old, honestly, but straight over.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. That is now the usual way in which people in New Zealand greet a gathering of more than 3 people. However, it was a rare greeting during the decades when the Archers were broadcast in New Zealand, and therein lies part of my story. In the 1950s, 60s and 70s, New Zealand was known for its farming, and in particular its butter and lamb, imported in large quantities to the United Kingdom. In the 1970s, New Zealand had a population of 3 million people and a phenomenal 60 million sheep, of whom we have 2 here today. They've lived rather a long age. As a farming country, and the country that was considered to be the most similar to Britain in the Commonwealth, New Zealand was a natural fit with the Archers and featured in the life of Ambridge in a tradition commenced by Aunt Laura Archer. Laura Archer arrived in Ambridge in 1957, the widow of Frank Archer. Frank was the brother of Dan. He had emigrated to New Zealand, where he ran virtually a parallel life to Dan. He married a New Zealander, Laura Archer, who had the most phenomenal Australian accent. She'd never get away with that today. They farmed in central Otago in the South Island. She came to Ambridge, and with her flamboyant style and sometimes outrageous behaviour, she was greatly admired by her great-niece Lillian, who, in fact, she was a role model, and we can see that in Lillian today. And since then, New Zealand has appeared at regular intervals, partly because of its farming, but also it's a convenient place if you want to get rid of a character for a while, or even permanently. One character did come back, it was Ruth, and she has come back and made repeated references to the New Zealand system, and I hope one day she'll explain to us what it is, because I haven't met a New Zealand farmer yet who knows what it is. The Archers holds a special place in New Zealand's broadcasting history. Broadcasts began in 1959. They ran a few years behind the UK. So in the late 1970s, when I and others emigrated, we listened to many episodes that we'd actually already heard before. The final episode in New Zealand was in September 1982, and it was in the lead up to the marriage of Eddie Grundy, as discussed by Dan Archer and his granddaughter Shula. Whoops. Go back.
Drink in the feathers and was as nice as anything. They're a funny lot, the Grundys.
Oh, Eddie will settle down. Wild boys always do once they're married with a couple of kids.
Poor Eddie. I suppose there'll come a time when settling down has a comfortable sound to it.
Shula actually said that in 1982. By 1982, Britain's loyal ally was the only overseas country still broadcasting the Archers. So, what was the story behind the Archers leaving New Zealand airwaves. What were we told in 1982? What do we now know, which was a completely different story, and what do I think? We were told in 1982, and it was printed in the newspaper, so it must have been right, that the ratings were falling. We were later told that that wasn't the case, that the Archers had a very loyal following in New Zealand. The recorded history of New Zealand broadcasting now tells us that the discontinuation of the Archers was partly financial. And to quote recorded history, neither the BBC nor Radio New Zealand could pay the large additional performing fees for broadcast outside the UK, which presumably means that somebody was paid less when New Zealand stopped broadcasting the Archers. It also coincided with a move for a more local approach to broadcasting, more New Zealand content and generally being more New Zealand. Broadcasting in New Zealand had been set up as a carbon copy of Britain. The processes of the BBC were just plopped into the country and replicated. By the late 1970s, post-colonial modernisation was evident in New Zealand as it was seeking to establish its own identity. This move would have happened anyway, but it was precipitated by an action in 1973 when Britain joined the EEC, a move that temporarily hurt New Zealand economically, and in particular farmers, as they initially struggled to find new markets for butter and lamb. And my opinion is that this is the reason the farming program had to go first. It was a point of principle. The final broadcast was held on the 30th of September 1982. It was spring in Ambridge and the daffodils were blooming. A special ending, at the request of the Radio New Zealand, was written and recorded by some of the actors, especially for New Zealand. And the final minute of this broadcast features the patriarch Dan Archer, who was still alive then, and one of the younger generation, Shula. The final minute is steeped in symbolism of every kind, which I'm not going to explain, I'm just going to allow you to hear, but they are predominantly symbols of life. The message is very clear. Life in Ambridge continues. But I will leave Dan and Shula to tell you that in their own way. They begin by talking about daffodils.
Daffodils going along the Am next April and the April after, and those bells will ring out year after year. I was hoping they might ring out for you and Mark one day.
Perhaps they will.
Hey?
One day. Come on, Grandad. It's time to go home.
Any questions?
I just wondered how you people that listened to the Archers and then had rested away from you, what did you do between then and coming back? Did you do the same takes from Britain or?
Well, in 1982 the Archers stopped. In 1983 I came back to Britain.
That was impressive.
Not because of the Archers, but because I was intending to do that anyway. I lived here for a few years and then went back and the Archers still wasn't there. Some very kind people listened to the omnibus and they happened to have a tape recorder sitting somewhere which they just inadvertently hit the... And I used to receive little packages, some of which I still have.
Oh, that's a resource.
But there were people that were quite hurt by it. There were people that were hurt by it. And when the news came out that it was being discontinued because ratings were falling, people were saying, that doesn't fit with what we're hearing. that wasn't the right story. If you want to actually hear the story as told by a New Zealand presenter, I can give you the video link. The whole history of New Zealand broadcasting, of radio broadcasting, has been put together in several online podcasts. And they actually tell you about 30 minutes into it, there's a little 5-minute bit about the Archers.
Mine's not a question, but it's backing on what you just said about the tapes. I started listening to the Archers in 1998 when I moved to America, and I was desperate to hear English voices because American television and radio was driving me mad. And my mum used to take the on the bus, send it over to me, and I'd listen and listen again. Then I'd send the tapes back and she'd keep sending them back. If I was lucky, I'd get Mrs. Kaisha's chair or something afterwards that I was spilled. And I'd been onto one of the Facebook groups, and I asked the question to them earlier in the year, because it was 20 years since I'd started listening. And there were many people on that forum as well that had started listening to it because they'd moved overseas and had that done. So got a lot to answer for.
I actually wrote to the BBC World Service and said, how about putting the Archers on the BBC World Service? And the reply came back, it's not our remit.
I was just going to say that when I lived in Taiwan, I never understood why it wasn't on the World Service. I think a lot of people around the world, it would be an amazing service. But I've never understood why the BBC don't do that.
It wasn't within the official remit of the BBC World Service, which was actually quite clearly defined.
Yeah, colonial.
Yeah.
Just saying, it was in fact on BBC Forces broadcasting.
Yeah. Was it?
I always read out the manual, they know that most of our soldiers sit around listening to the Archers would have got nothing better.
Oh, I'm glad the armed forces got it. That was good.
Can you think of circumstances under which being sent to Birmingham or being sent to New Zealand, which would you choose? Because, you know, Birmingham is as much of being out of the way as New Zealand, you know.
Not quite.
No, people go to Birmingham or New Zealand. That's the only places they go.
Right. Okay, well.
Went to Canada.
Yes.
Yes. All right.
But people do go to New Zealand more than any other country.
Yeah.
I have actually checked this. People have been to New Zealand more than any other country in the Commonwealth or in the world. Lillian went to Canada. She lost her husband there. People have been to South Africa. A little bit of dabbling in Australia, but New Zealand consistently comes back and back and back.
I'm a doctor by trade. I'm a